kind of pipeline 101 for communities. So you're going to see me jumping around. Like the first slide is one that we did on behalf of the mayor of Salt Lake City a few years ago after they had a spill there. You know, these things, we're trying to condense what probably should be 2 days worth of, if Bill Bird was charging for it, I'm going to heckle in return here, it'd be 2 days worth of, you know, very basic information to get through this. And if we're lucky, we're given an hour, which is kind of what I have today. Often people will want, well, can you come do a Pipelines 101 in about 15 minutes? And that's brutal. I did it in Toledo, Ohio last week. So we have a little more time. I encourage people to interrupt me if you don't understand what I've said or if you disagree with what I've said. And I'm just going to go through this, but since this isn't a specific community, you're going to see me kind of jump around on the slides. So this is a slide when we were invited to Salt Lake City, and some of them will relate, but I'm going to jump all over the place. Normally when I do this, you know, I introduce myself and I tell a little bit about who the Pipeline Safety Trust is and where we came from, just because people need to know the context of what I'm saying and where I'm coming from, because it's different than other stakeholders. You know, and I think for the people that don't know, and a lot of you have probably seen this, you know, the Pipeline Safety Trust was born from a tragedy that happened in Bellingham in 1999, when, like most pipeline accidents, multiple things went wrong, any one of which, if it had been corrected either by the company beforehand or caught by the regulators and corrected, the tragedy wouldn't have happened. You know, the pipeline had been damaged by excavation damage before it failed. The damage was known to the company, but it hadn't been fixed. There was a valve that had been installed wrong and had closed multiple times on its own, causing pressure waves on the pipeline. The SCADA system that controls the pipeline actually went down during the middle of this failure, so the operating room was operating in the blind. And then the pipeline burst because the valve swung shut again, pressure wave flowed down the valve, hit this flaw in the pipeline that had been struck by an excavator and burst, dumping 250,000 gallons of unleaded gasoline into a stream that runs right through the middle of Bellingham. When that gasoline found an ignition source, it exploded, blew up, burned for hours up and down about 2 miles of the stream, killed every living thing in the creek, along with these 3 boys who were playing in a park. So that's where I come from approaching pipeline safety, and I, like everybody else in Bellingham, didn't even realize we had pipelines and hadn't even thought about pipelines until that June day in 1999. Yep. SCADA, yes, I shouldn't be using acronyms. That's basically the computerized system that allows the operator in a control room, usually far away. You know, a lot of the pipelines are controlled from Houston or Calgary or somewhere else. This one was south of Seattle, to monitor the pipeline, and they can shut off valves, increase pressures, reduce pressures, that type of stuff. And I should be able to tell you what SCADA means, but I bet one of the hecklers can tell us.
Supervisory control and data acquisition.
That's what I was going to say, yeah. So, you know, ever since we came into being in 1999, there was a group that formed before the Pipeline Safety Trust Incorporated. We have really focused on changing federal law because, as you've heard this morning a little bit, most all of the pipeline safety regulations start at the federal level. That's the federal government sets the minimum standard. So we really focused a lot in the first 5 to 10 years of our existence on the feds and on Congress. And we've had success there. We've snuck a number of things into reauthorization through Congress. We also try to increase a lot of access to pipeline information, and we've been very successful on that, mainly because the federal government thought it was a good idea too. There's so much information now, it's sometimes hard to figure it out. And the states are catching up with that too. We provide a public interest voice. I go to all kinds of pipeline meetings and workshops, and often when you ask who's in the room, the public, I'm the only one sitting there. That's starting to change a little bit, but so a public interest voice at meetings, public interest voice with the media. I spend almost half my life these days talking to reporters. And then we partner with any group that's trying to move pipeline safety forward, and it's one of those embrace the conflict, because sometimes we'll be partnering with the American Petroleum Institute to do something, and the next day we'll be partnering with the Sierra Club. So that's an interesting dance to do oftentimes. And we sit on a number of state and federal technical committees. The unique thing that created us was the stars lining up over that incident because it went criminal. It was one of the few incidents in the country where pipeline personnel actually went to jail. And as the U.S. Justice Department moved forward on prosecuting this case, they were so aghast at the way back in 1999 that company had operated and maintained that pipeline, and equally aghast at the way the federal government had failed to provide much oversight, that they went to bat for the idea of creating a national watchdog organization to keep an eye on both the regulators and the industry, and that became the Pipeline Safety Trust. And that's the quote, the Godzilla versus Bambi thing isn't our picture, that's what the judge referred to us when she was giving us the money. And it was pretty strange because we kind of floated this idea. The families who lost their kids had floated the idea and hadn't heard much. And then all of a sudden one day we got a call saying, we've got a check for you in Seattle. If somebody wants to, do you want us to mail it or are you going to come get it? And it's like, well, $4 million check, we'll drive down and get that. And it came with no strings attached. We suspected if this happened, we'd have to report to PHMSA or report to EPA or report to somebody. And it was like, here's money, go do good stuff. And the families, luckily, were very smart and invested it well and treated it as an endowment, and we still have that $4 million in the bank and live to a grand degree off that investment. One of our basic beliefs, and I'll sooner or later get to the Pipeline 101 stuff, I think the next slide, is that, you heard the three-legged stool thing already this morning, where you need strong legs from regulators, operators, and the public in local governments. I'm not going to go through that again, you heard it. So here's the Pipelines 101 for the people that don't know it and for the hecklers that want to correct me. This is kind of a diagram of the natural gas pipeline system. You can see on the left kind of the production side of things. The pipelines there in red for the most part are production or gathering pipelines. There was lots of questions this morning about unregulated gathering pipelines. Because the makeup of those pipelines has changed a lot as a lot of these shale plays have come in. So then once they go through a processing plant, they move into transmission pipelines, which tend to be the bigger, higher pressure pipelines that move gas, between facilities and between communities and across state lines. And finally, it goes into a city gate, which is basically a way to ratchet down that pressure to deliver it to our homes and businesses through the gas distribution pipelines. So those are the three main types of pipelines on the natural gas side, and none of this stuff is completely black and white. Here's the same thing for hazardous liquid pipelines. It's basically kind of the same. You have the same production gathering lines on the upstream end, moving into transmission lines, taking mainly crude oil into refineries, and then transmission lines moving refined product from refineries to wherever it's going to get distributed. The one difference with a hazardous liquid system is you don't really have a distribution pipeline system like you do with gas. The distribution tends to be through trucks and those types of things. Types of pipelines, we've already talked hazardous liquid, natural gas, distribution, gathering, production facility lines. I mentioned those in the diagrams. The other thing to remember is there's interstate pipelines, which are pipelines, the easiest way to remember it is those are pipelines that cross a straight line. It's not quite that clear cut, but that's the easiest way to think about it. If a pipeline crosses a straight line, it's interstate. If it doesn't, then it's intra. And that makes a lot of difference because of who can and cannot regulate the different types of pipelines. Just make it clear, natural gas pipelines carry natural gas. That's really easy. Hazardous liquid pipelines carry a variety of things. Crude oil, refined products, jet fuel, diesel, gasoline, highly volatile liquids, things like propane and butane, which lots of people think of those as a gas. And if it was here in the room, it would be a gas. But when you put it in a pipeline under pressure, it moves like a liquid. And I mentioned that at one of my slides this morning of a big spill of ethane, because it's a very strange thing because it moves like a liquid until it gets out of the pipeline. Then it still moves like a liquid for a while until it starts to volatilize and turn into a gas. So for emergency response, it's kind of a very unique creature to have to deal with. And carbon dioxide and ammonia are also moved through liquid pipelines. This is, and I don't know if these numbers are up to date, they look pretty accurate. The national pipeline system just kind of gives you the mileage of hazardous liquid versus gas pipelines. The one thing that's not very accurate in here is the gathering number, and I didn't really break it out much. And I think Jeff showed a slide this morning that said something like 17,000 miles of gathering lines. Well, those are gathering lines that the federal government regulates. There's hundreds of thousands of miles of gathering lines that aren't included in these numbers that are unregulated, basically. So that mileage number for gathering lines is off a little bit. And you can see by far the biggest mileage is in the distribution system. It delivers the gas to our homes and businesses. And normally when I do this to a specific community, I break it out because specific communities are interested in what's going on there. So you see a breakout of, the current pipeline system, and this was for Utah a couple of years ago. Yep.
How is it decided which of those gathering lines are regulated and which are not?
It's basically a population thing. Gathering lines that run through urban areas, populated areas are regulated gathering lines, and they're kind of regulated to a lesser degree than a transmission line that would be going through the same area, but there are some regulations. If you're in a rural area that has a certain density of houses, they're completely off the federal regulatory scheme, and you heard lots of arguments about why that is earlier this morning. I also show, local communities, kind of the breakdown of what pipelines they have in their communities. And all of this stuff is available on the PHMSA website these days. It's pretty easy to get your hands on. So this just showed what Utah, which doesn't have a whole lot of pipes, had a few years ago, and kind of what that percent is. And you used to be able to look at it at the county level. And since we were doing this in Salt Lake City, which has 3 or 4 counties kind of descending there, I broke it down and showed them how it works out county level. For some reason, PHMSA's taken this off of their website, and you can't get county level data anymore. I don't know if that's coming back at some point or another. In a place like Salt Lake City that has a limited number of pipelines, it's always good to tell people who those systems are, and this is just kind of the major systems that were going through Salt Lake City. If you were in a place probably like New Orleans or Houston or lots of places, there'd be way too many pipelines to try to list. So it made my job easy in Salt Lake City. One of the things people always want to know is where are the pipelines in their community, and I'm going to leap to, I think this is Ohio now, and there is a national pipeline mapping system. If you go on Google and type in National Pipeline Mapping System, you can find a public viewer that you can either, you choose your state and your county, and it will give you a county level view of all the, this is just transmission pipelines, hazardous liquid and natural gas transmission pipelines on the county. And you have to look county by county. It won't give you a broader view than that. And this is when I was speaking at the University of Toledo, this was the county that the University of Toledo sits in Ohio, right by Lake Erie. So this is the county level with the red ones showing up as, those are hazardous liquid pipelines, and the blue ones are gas transmission pipelines. Through the the National Pipeline Mapping System, you can drill down to about this level of details, as close as you can get before it kind of goes dark on you. But this gives you a pretty good idea, where the pipelines are, which roads they run along, where they are. I always drill down close because it sometimes surprises people to find out. It was interesting because at this University of Toledo meeting, everybody was freaking out about the pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac in Michigan because it was a Great Lakes Water Conference, and freaking out about a pipeline under the St. Clair River near Detroit, and that was all you were hearing about. Well, I just drilled down, not knowing anything, into the NPMS and found out there was 15 hazardous liquid pipelines going across the mouth of the Maumee River right by Lake Erie that none of the activists in the room or the lawyers in the room ever knew about. And it's like, well, what about those ones? Oh, that's a good idea. You can also get some basic information out of the National Pipeline Mapping System. That red star there is where I clicked. You hit a little icon and you click on it, and the information below then tells you some basic information about the pipelines that are there. And basically what you learn is the type of pipeline, whether it's crude oil or natural gas, in the operator. And the operator ID. And with that information, you can drill down deeper if you know where to go, but that's about all that the public can get from the National Pipeline Mapping System. And that's the rule. It's not actually a rulemaking, but there's comment period open right now on some of the National Pipeline Mapping System that I think Samia mentioned last night to some of you. If you're an elected official, you can get a special secret password and you can get more information out of this. And I went and got myself elected as a county commissioner just so I could get the secret password, and boy, that was a waste of time. I mean, becoming a county commissioner to get the password, and it shows you a little more information like population densities. It shows you some sensitive areas that you can't get on this, but it doesn't show you a whole lot more than what the public can get. I think that may be changing because there's an emphasis at least to provide emergency responders more information through the National Pipeline Mapping System about specifics about the type of material in the pipelines and perhaps size and pressure of the pipelines too. It doesn't talk about age at all. Age is a tough one to find. There are ways you can drill down through the annual reports that companies have to. So if you get this operator ID number off the National Pipeline Mapping System and then go to the annual reports, you can start finding out about age, but even that's kind of, it talks about the whole pipeline. So if you're trying to find out what the age in your backyard is, good luck. I mean, the best way is to call the numbers here or call the company and ask them, because often companies will be glad to tell you that type of stuff. Diameter? Yeah, it doesn't tell that. Every once in a while it'll be in some of these, but the National Pipeline Mapping System doesn't. Again, you can find that out through either the annual reports sometimes. If there's been a failure, you can look at failure reports, or just call the company and ask them, and they often will share that information.
This may be really a one-on-one question. You talk about
It's better than heckling.
hazardous liquid pipelines and then the natural gas lines. If the material in the line, say the diluent from a tar sands project, which is mostly naphtha and other natural gas condensates, is in an oil line corridor, if it behaves like a gas when it's released from the line, what is the value or the relevancy of calling it a liquid just when it's in the line? We're talking about first responders or the ways in which the material in the line will be dealt with. There's a breach, which is what most people are concerned about. Why the differentiation between a natural gas line and what would be a gas if it weren't contained under those pressures?
Right, I think that's one of the issues I kind of just mentioned a little bit. I mean, when it's in the pipeline, it's moving more like a liquid than a gas, so the liquid regulations apply. You know, I think what we've been hearing from emergency responders in the public is your exact thing, but if it comes out, it can act differently, and that's why I think there's some movement to put more specificity, at least for emergency responders, to get their hands on that material. So if the pipeline fails, instead of just calling it a liquids line, they'll know that it might be a line that has those types of constituents that could turn into a gas, so they're responding correctly. Whether that type of information will be available to the public is pretty much up in the air at this point. Anything else? Where the regulations come from is pretty enlightening, because you really have to know that if you're trying to make things safer, or if you want to impact that. You know, the U.S. Congress really sets the statute. So the federal government creates the minimum pipeline safety standards, and they really are the minimum, and you shouldn't expect that that the minimum is the best you could do. But it starts with the U.S. Congress, so isn't that reassuring? So they set the standards, and then the Department of Transportation, PHMSA, Office of Pipeline Safety, whichever name you want to use, you know, interprets those statutes and turns those into rules and regulations. And that goes through the whole same regulatory process that most rules do. You know, there's comment periods and all that, and there's some of those open right now, a big one for hazardous liquid pipelines. So that's where the federal regulations come from. There's questions this morning about routing, and for interstate natural gas pipelines, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, deals with the routing, and there is an environmental impact statement process and all that for natural gas pipelines. As people mentioned, there isn't that for hazardous liquid pipelines or for intrastate pipelines. An intrastate gas pipeline that's all within one state does not go through FERC. That's kind of left up to the states too. And that's where states have some control. They can set up a process for dealing with that routing, and some states do a very good job of that, and some states don't. And the states can actually pass stronger rules for intrastate pipelines. And I've got a slide here in a while that shows that most states have done that. It's over 1,100 rules that go beyond the federal regulations that states have created, mainly for intrastate gas lines. And then local governments have some control too. It gets pretty cloudy pretty quickly, but they can use their planning, zoning, and land use certainly to control development encroaching on top of pipelines and perhaps helping steer pipelines through local communities and to making sure that emergency responders think about these things. What do the regulations cover? I'm not going to go through all of this, but yep.
If you back up just a second, in addition to what you have listed there are a number of oversight and review agencies like the NTSB, GAO, sometimes the IG for the agency, who also either as a result of studies or other kinds of investigations make pretty strong recommendations about rules, and I think we heard some of that this morning earlier, but those typically are regarded as mandates or near mandates for rulemaking as well.
Yep, that's a good point. We're going to hear from NTSB later about a study they did on integrity management that gave PHMSA a whole bunch of kind of new mandates to work on, and certainly the GAO and the IG, Congress often asks them to produce a report or a study that then can turn into it's certainly a push in the rulemaking realm. And if you're trying to do this in 15 minutes, you don't have time to talk about that. Here's what the regulations cover, and they cover the whole realm of things. These are the pipeline safety regulations, and they cover everything from reporting to annual reports that have to be turned in, the operations, maintenance, inspections of pipelines. There's different sections for natural gas pipelines versus hazardous liquid pipelines because the regulations are somewhat different because they're really different materials moving through those pipelines. There's a whole different section just on response plans, cleanup plans for hazardous liquid pipelines. And then there's a section that talks about grants and drug and alcohol testing. Here's the slide that talks about added protections from the states, mainly on intrastate pipelines, mainly on gas. The state regulators, NAPSR, the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives, puts out this compendium, and that's a picture of it there that's online, and you can click on that and find out what each state has done. In some states, I think New Hampshire leads the way on this. They've added 113 additional protections under their rules. And other states have done nothing. I think when I was doing this in Utah hasn't done anything on top of the federal regulations. I looked at Louisiana yesterday just so I could add that for some context, and Louisiana's added 8 additional kind of safety things above and beyond the federal regulations. And I think that's why Jeff, when people were asking him about gathering lines, since most gathering lines are intrastate, it's much easier for a state to come in and perhaps create regulations on gathering lines because they don't have to go through a lot of the cost-benefit stuff that the feds have to do. The states may have some of that same stuff built into their systems, but some states could move much quicker, like Ohio did here a year or two ago. So that's a very interesting compendium for advocates that are looking to see what their state has done. Communities also, it's important to make clear who regulates what in certain communities, and this is for Louisiana, where their Department of Natural Resources regulates intrastate gas and intrastate hazardous liquid. That's kind of interesting that they're doing both gas and liquid because that's not the norm. Most states just do natural gas. But they're looking at both intra, so ones that don't leave the state line for the most part. And then PHMSA oversees all the interstate pipelines here in Louisiana. So anything that's coming in from another state has federal inspectors, enforcement, and oversight. Just a few real basic things to remember about pipeline regulations is the rules often have multiple layers depending on the threat. Corrosion is a good example. Corrosion is a big issue on pipelines. There's multiple things in the regulations to protect pipelines from corrosion. The type of coating you put on it, the way you put cathodic protection on the pipeline, this electrical charge you put on the pipeline that counteracts corrosion, the way you run inspection devices through to measure corrosion and how often you have to do that. So there's multiple layers there. Many parts of the regulations are based on risk assessment and management, so the regulations might not be real prescriptive, telling you exactly what to do. It just tells the operators they need to run safe pipelines and kind of sets a framework for how you determine that. And the regulations tend to be more stringent in higher consequence areas. As you get into it, you'll find HCAs, high consequence areas. There are different definitions for gas and liquids, but if you're in a high consequence areas, you actually have to inspect your pipelines. If you're outside of a high consequence area, you never have to inspect your pipelines. That's not a very black and white statement either, but you don't have to use internal smart pigs, basically, outside of high consequence areas. And for hazardous liquid pipelines, high consequence areas are both a population thing and an environmentally sensitive area. So if you're in a watershed or a navigable waterway or a drinking water source, you're probably a high consequence area. Natural gas is based just on population density for the most part. And those are designations that the public, for the most part, can't ever see. You won't know if you're in a high consequence area or not, although anybody that thinks about it much can guess. Prescriptive versus performance-based is a thing to remember for regulations too. A lot of the regulations are performance-based, kind of sets out a framework for how an operator ought to do things, but it recognizes that every pipeline's different, the train's different, so it allows the pipeline operator lots of flexibility in how they get there. Prescriptive would be more telling them exactly what to do. And if you think about it as far as the interstate highway system, it's very prescriptive. You have a 70-mile-per-hour speed sign out there, tells you exactly what to do, and the regulator, the state cops, know exactly what to do if you're going 78. If you turn that to a performance-based system, you take down all those speed signs and just put up a smiley face that says drive safely. I don't know whether that would change safety on our interstate system or not. But it would make it really hard for a regulator, for the state cops, to know when they can pull somebody over. People get confused. The media gets confused. Everybody gets confused about what is an inspection. And I bet I can get some heckling on this one. Because the word inspection is used over and over again. And there's really, in my mind, three main types of inspections. There's right-of-way inspections, which companies are pretty much required to do on all their pipelines. And a lot of that takes place by airplane. They fly over the pipeline on kind of a regular basis, looking for people doing bad stuff on their right-of-way or looking for dead trees that could indicate something's gone wrong with the pipeline. That happens on most all pipelines. You know, you hear about integrity inspections where they run smart pigs like the one shown there through pipelines, and they really are assessing how good the pipeline is in shape. They can find minute anomalies on a pipeline, corrosion, dents, cracks, those types of things. And the operators do that. You know, there's confusion that somehow the federal inspectors come in and run smart pigs through the pipelines, and that's not happening. That's left up to the operator, and based on their, oh, here comes the major heckler. And that's based on their integrity management plan. So that's left up to the operator. And then there's regulatory inspections, which the regulators do. And to a grand degree, they certainly go out and kick the tires a little bit, but a lot of it is more of an audit function where they're coming in and trying to see if the companies are obeying the regulations, whether their integrity management plans they've drafted, they're following those. So that type of inspection is much more kind of hands-off. It's not a physical inspection as much as the other types. The one thing that people often don't understand is that even with performance-based regulations, each company writes an integrity management plan, which could be very different from one company to the next. But once they adopt that integrity management plan, it becomes something that the regulator can enforce against, even if it's not required under the regulations. So if a company writes themselves a very good integrity management plan that goes way beyond the integrity or beyond the federal regulations, that becomes enforceable by PHMSA. I get that right, Jeff? All right. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, I had come across a study, and I'm just a citizen group, and we're trying to educate ourselves, so this is very helpful, that smart pigs came in third behind oil company personnel and ordinary citizens in identifying threats in terms of their record, and also that the data that comes from the smart pig runs is not available to the general public. Do you have any additional information on that?
I think you're getting two things confused. The second part, the data is not available to the general public, that's pretty much the truth. Sometimes it's not even available to state governments that want it. The first thing about the smart pigs coming in third, I think you're confusing that with leak detection systems. There was a study, and I think PHMSA funded it a few years ago, that looked at leak detection, because you heard companies over and over again saying, we have a state-of-the-art leak detection and we'll shut down a pipeline within minutes. And PHMSA did the study and come to find out that wasn't really the truth. That the employees of the pipeline company that are just out and about there, or the citizens living near the pipeline, found pipeline leaks way more often than the leak detection systems did. And to some degree, they've changed the name. Some groups are now, and they're not calling it leak detection anymore. They're calling it rupture detection, because they work pretty good. If the pipeline really bursts and releases all the pressure, those systems can identify that and deal with that fairly rapidly. But a small leak, those types of systems don't find them as much as the public. I think that was the study you're thinking about, maybe. Sounded like it. But yeah, there's always a big push for, you hear the public all the time saying, well, give us your pig run data so we can look at it and verify what the anomalies are. And the industry folks can help me out on this, but that's pretty specialized stuff. If they handed it to me, I would have no idea what I'm looking for. So you'd have to hire somebody, and there's probably, you can probably count the people that could understand that stuff on a few hands. The public groups I see asking for that don't know what they're asking for often, unless you're ready to spend a lot of money to hire somebody that can interpret it for you. Now, I think those groups that interpret that give a report to the pipeline company that talks about, here's what we found and here's what we think you ought to do, and I think those types of reports would be very helpful for the public. But that's often not what I hear the public asking for. Come on, somebody's got to heckle that one.
That's pretty close.
Damn.
But even a smart pig result, if you had a report, the operator is required to do what they call data integration. Just a report by itself still isn't enough information to be able to assess the integrity of the pipeline. So if you just got one report, you still don't know everything.
Yeah, and the key thing about those reports is looking at them every so often. So a smart pig is so sensitive, after the Bellingham incident, they ran smart pigs that were finding thousands of anomalies per mile of that pipeline. And that sounds scary, but a lot of those they're so sensitive they find very minute issues. So the benefit of a smart pig is when you run that again 3 years later, 5 years later, 7 years later, you can look at that same spot and see if it's changed. So a small anomaly might not be a big deal safety-wise, but if you look at it 3 years later and it's got much larger, that's a lot of the benefit of a smart pig. Yep.
The only other thing I would say is on the smart pigs, you can't run them on all pipelines. So you don't run them on distribution lines that are smaller diameter, smaller pressure. Those are the ones that go into the homes and businesses. Those are the vast majority of the pipeline network. They are run on a lot of the liquid lines and the interstate transmission pipelines, the really big things that go from state to state. When you get to the intrastate, a little bit more difficult because of the valves and the configurations and a lot of other things. But even with the smart pigs, you have to look at there's a wide variety of tools that are in that. So some do corrosion, and some look for other types of material defects. So you have to pick and choose what you're trying to run. You can't do it all at once, and so the tool will pick up what you ran it for. That was the only other thing I was mentioning.
Right. No, and that's a good point. And when I have time during these things, it'd be good to put up a whole slide on the different types of smart pigs and what they look for, because sometimes you can have very good smart pigs, but you have very dumb people running them, and they might have corrosion problems, but they're running a tool that's looking for something else. So there's a lot of those issues, and we'll probably hear a little bit about that during the integrity management session later this afternoon. And smart pigs tend to get smarter all the time. They're getting better at picking up certain anomalies, and they're getting better. When they first started, they couldn't go around a bend because they were so stiff. And they're making smart pigs that can go around tighter and tighter bends and when pipes change sizes. They couldn't do that a number of years ago too, and now they can go through different pipes that change sizes. So
Robotics now too.
yep.
Hey, Carl, I wanted to just emphasize the point that Christina made at the end. for that tiny anomaly has already done its damage.
They're modeling, I'm not the expert here, so I won't try to be worse. I will tell you that there are fairly advanced modeling tools that are out there that say this thing analyzes the cyclic pressure on the line and those kind of patterns and kind of goes for that. But there is no silver bullet, so you have to be conservative. So I agree with you. You have to be conservative.
Yep.
Why is it called a pig?
Oh, well, that's the most interesting story of the whole thing. I don't know if this is an urban legend or the truth, but when they first started running these, it wasn't smart pigs with computers. It was pigs that were doing things like cleaning the inside of the pipeline. And when they first started running these, when they'd move through a pipeline, they would make a squealing noise, and that's where the name pig came from. Anybody want to here's a smart pig expert here.
I disagree with that because I'm from England. The first people to build pipes were the Romans, and the Romans had pillars and backs. They had pipes to take the excrement away. So the way they cleaned the pipe was to take a pig's bladder, put it on the end of a stick, and push it down the pipe.
Ah,
And from then on, anything to clean a pipe was a pig.
all right.
And then you're right. It started as cleaning pigs, then it became smart pigs, but they were always pigs because of the Romans.
Right, and that is that's a smart pig expert there, so anybody that wants to get into the questions, he's the guy to talk to when we're done here. One of the things when we go into communities, and we also get questions all the time when we get phone calls all the time, people wondering about a pipeline in their community, and they call us up and they say, is that pipeline safe? And that's really something that we don't think we can answer. We can't ever answer, really, because safety means something different to every person, I would never parachute out of an airplane, and other people think that's perfectly safe. So safety varies a lot, and the thing that people need to remember is that risk is kind of a basis of what's the probability something's going to happen versus the consequence if it does. And for pipelines, it's a very, very, very low probability that something's going to go bad, but the consequences can be huge. It's interesting because when you tend to listen to operators and even the regulators, they tend to focus on the probability more, and the public tends to focus on the consequence more, which makes for interesting discussions sometimes. This is just a thing I put up that often creates some discussion because you can do a statistical calculation based on the mileage of pipelines in certain in national stuff, and I think this when I was in Ohio. I just looked at Ohio stuff, and you would think you would see a significant incident on a hazardous liquid pipeline in Ohio once every 1,325 years on any 1 mile of pipeline. And it was interesting because when we looked at what Ohio was actually experiencing, this was almost exactly correct. You look at other states, and it could be on either side of that because raw statistic averages like this aren't always very accurate. So that's the probability. Does that make you feel safe? But then there's the consequence too, which is what the public looks at too. And even though it's a low probability, when something goes wrong, we've seen things can go really, really wrong. And I love data, so you're going to have to endure a whole bunch of graphs here. So this is serious incidents, and I think you saw this morning kind of in a different version. In serious incidents, it's defined in federal regulations. It's basically if someone ends up dead or in the hospital. And that shows the 3 main types of pipelines. Gas distribution on the top. You can see that serious incidents have been going down, although that's where most of the deaths and injuries occur, which makes sense because there's lots and lots more of those all over our communities in proximity to people than there are the other types of pipelines. And the hazardous liquid and the gas transmission is down there at the bottom, and they've been trending down too, and they're relatively low to begin with. If you look at significant incidents are also defined, and it includes more than it includes deaths and injuries, but it also includes things like how much is spilled and property damage. And this is a significant incidents, I think, over the last 20 years, more or less. And on the top is hazardous liquid. There's more significant incidents on hazardous liquid. The trend line over 20 years is basically kind of downward. It's kind of troubling if you look at about the last 10 years. It looks like that trend line has kind of turned and is going up. Distribution lines, again, they're in the middle on the green, have continued to trend downward. I think a lot of that is because distribution lines get hit a lot by third-party excavation, and there's been a huge emphasis for the last 10 years now on using the one-call system, and I think that's starting to drive down some of the incidents on gas distribution lines. And over the 20-year period, you know, transmission lines tends to moving in an upward value, although if you look at the last 10 years, it's been pretty stable. And there's anywhere time you're doing averages like this, it's a little less than accurate because there's mileage increases that have been going on too on some of these that if you put that in consideration, it might change doesn't really change this very much. People also really like to know what the numbers are in their local community. So if I'm doing this is when I was doing it for the Great Lakes. I showed each state's, you know, the number of significant incidents each state had over the last, I see this since 2010, the last 5 years, and kind of the property damage. This is for gas, both the distribution and transmission. You can kind of see how that works. I think the take-home question, or the take-home lesson on looking at the gas is that you see that the injuries and deaths are in the distribution side of things. And I think that's where Jeff was poking me this morning, because a lot of that tends to be excavation. You know, if somebody's on a backhoe and they hit a pipeline, guess who's likely to end up dead or injured?
I like the fact that you're wearing your pin.
Yeah, I do that just for you, Jeff.
It's important to note that on that property damage, we're actually toying with that, and Alan will pull that out in his presentation this afternoon. A lot of that is the operator. It's their property or their facility, so it's a significant part of property damage is the operator's actual equipment and facility. So,
Yeah, and I've got a slide about that this afternoon too.
okay,
We'll see if Alan and I duel over that or not.
don't show up for that.
I believe one of the changes that you made in the incident reporting started in 2010 is you actually break apart the property damage. So you can actually look at
Right.
damage to the public versus damage to the operator.
Right, so yeah, it could be the pipeline itself replacing it. It could be the emergency. Well, here's the hazardous liquid incidents for the states for the same period. And for hazardous liquid, it includes, you know, what it costs to clean it up, which could be a huge piece. You have a 5,000 gallon spill, it might not create any real property damage on private property, but the cost of cleaning it up even within their own facility could cost a lot.
Is there any measurement of environmental damage? You know, human health, of course, is paramount, but it seems like this might be missing incidents that are affecting, you know, waterways or...
Well, the only way that's captured, and it's captured here because the take-home message, if you look at this hazardous liquid, is you see, if you go back, what was, you know, $60 or $45 million worth of property damage over, you know, that 5-year period for natural gas. If you look at hazardous liquid, you're up over $1 billion. So the property damage captures some of that environmental damage, because if you end up with crude oil in a river, the cost of cleaning it up is included in that cost. But it doesn't really get the point I think you're...
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like some of these might be missed entirely. If nobody dies or is injured, it doesn't count. You know, so even then does that property damage, the natural resources, does that even get counted?
Yeah, other than the cleanup costs and the emergency response, originally I don't think it does. And there's even an argument now, and you'll hear this a little bit this afternoon too, I think, of, you know, the property damage from release of natural gas has never really been counted in, and now as we're starting to understand methane and climate change, you know, the question is, should we be somehow treating that as property damage as a spill like we do for liquids?
Can you ask, where are you getting all the data from?
This is all from PHMSA. Yeah, and you know, we walk people through their data a lot, so if people are interested in this type of stuff, call us up and we can tell you where to find this. This type of incident data is pretty easy to find on their website.
And can you drill down and see more details about it?
You can drill down and find out each particular incident. So you know, it says there's been 11 incidents in Wisconsin. It'd be pretty easy to find out what those incidents were, what the company was, and then it'll give you fields that will blow your mind on a whole lot of things.
Just looking at Michigan, you've got 881 million there. I know that the Kalamazoo spill is currently calculated to be about 1.2 billion in cleanup costs. How do those numbers square up? That's 2010 to present, and
Right.
significantly short.
Yeah, and most all of that is that Kalamazoo spill, but it doesn't jive with what you read in the newspapers about the real costs. And sometimes there's a lag between when the costs are reported because they can amend their incident reports. I poked a stick in my thing this morning about the Refugio spill in Santa Barbara. No, it wasn't that. It was the Yellowstone spill that happened in January, because if you look at that, it says there was no emergency response property cost at all. And Jeff has went and fixed that now and is going to contradict me.
You're actually right, because after you said that, we texted back to Blaine and said, what the hell, Carl is saying this, and he came back and said it's true. So to your point, it depends on the operator. It's not a final report. If they go too long, we'll ping them for the data, but it's submitted by the operator. And so in that case, the operator has to do one. We will ping them.
See, and that's one of the things. This data is available now, so people can look at it. And you could question PHMSA, why does it say 888 when Enbridge is reporting, a billion? Right. A whole bunch of costs. Yeah, and the property cost isn't just cleanup; it's even the value of the lost fuel. Right. Right, and I don't think fines and legal costs that are part of the 1.2 billion would show up here as property damage. Moving right along, there's lots of charts that talk about showing what the causes of pipeline failures are. Here it is nationally for, oh boy, this is so small on my screen I can't read what I've got here. It looks like this is all pipelines over the last 10 years. And this just kind of, I don't really like this chart much because I think mixing gas distribution with hazardous liquid is kind of clouds the picture. We were doing this in California, so we looked at what all the causes were in California, and if you look at those two charts, they're actually fairly close. There's a little more problem with third-party damage in California. But when you drill down and start looking at specific pipelines, this is gas distribution nationally. You can see, you often hear about the one-call system and excavation damage, and for gas distribution, it clearly is the #1 cause of pipeline incidents.
The other outside source, most of that are people hitting above-ground structures.
Right, driving their car into a meter.
A lot of drunk drivers, medical conditions.
Yeah, so you have to decipher the terms, and outside force damage, especially on gas distribution, it freaks me out because once I learned this and I'm walking through my neighborhood, you see all these gas meters on a driveway, next to the house driveway with a gas meter, and then you watch these people try to back their trailers in past the gas meter, and when they don't do that successfully, it shows up as natural or outside force damage. So this is California. Nationally, California, you can see they're fairly similar. Gas transmission nationally, the take-home messages here is it's not as much excavation damage, it's more things like welds, equipment failures, corrosion. When we looked at this for California, it jumped out because that chart is quite a bit different. And I think it's excavation damage. You have to also look at the number of incidents because over 5 years there's only been 37 incidents. So it doesn't take very many to start skewing these types of charts.
If you look at this a different way, and I encourage you to, in the tool that we're revealing this afternoon, and Alan will be talking about it, you can go into it by consequence. While you might have fewer by a frequency analysis by consequence, this weekend and a couple of months ago, I know there were people killed, by excavation damage, by doing the wrong thing, digging in there. People are killed, 3 injured, 1 dead. They shouldn't have been doing that, but it's the high consequence, not as frequent maybe. So look at it from both sides, frequency and consequence.
And here's the same chart for California that puts them both on the same page for hazardous liquid, and you can see that for some reason in California they have way more corrosion problems, it would appear, than the rest of the nation. But again, it's a fairly small number of incidents. We kind of drilled down in some of this stuff when we were doing this project in California and looked at specific things like incidents per year per mile, because we're kind of making things more even when you divide it by mile. And what the first graph shows is that whether you're looking at the United States, which is in blue, or California in red, crude oil has way more incidents than product pipelines in both California and in the United States. For some reason, California was having more significant incidents in both. We looked at it a different way, basically on, we were looking at a Kinder Morgan pipeline. So this color is non-crude product pipelines, and this is crude oil. And what you see is that while California has more incidents, the amount of gallons spilled in California is way lower than the national averages. So that kind of tells me that they were probably smaller incidents that didn't spill very much compared to the national stuff. Just to move on, that was some data that helps inform how people think about risk in their own areas. There's certainly lots of examples of consequences too. Consequences from crude oil spill are, particular liability for local governments. This is a excavation damage that happened near where I live. And I think this finally got out of court, but it was in court for a number of years with the pipeline operator arguing with the local government. It turned out the local government hadn't located right, and the pipeline got spilled and ended up in the ocean. The oil did. Lots of damage from liquid pipelines or crude oil pipelines to the environment. This was a spill into the Kentucky River a number of years ago, damage to it closed down the drinking water source for Louisville for a while. Natural gas pipelines tend to be more explosions and fires. Even just the pressure. This is a picture of a pipeline that failed in Washington State. There was no explosion, there was no fire. This is just the pressure of the gas coming out of the pipeline. I mean, when you put a big pipeline under that pressure, it can dig a pretty big hole when it fails. Liquid products tend to be pretty close to crude oil. They will catch fire a little more often, and they can contaminate soil and groundwater. So that's the consequence versus the probability. These are some natural gas, and here's some other natural gas. That's the San Bruno tragedy. Natural gas is a little easier to predict the consequences because there's a formula that calculates potential impact radius, and if you put in the pressure of the pipeline and the diameter, you can get these circles that will show if the pipeline failed in the middle of the circle. This is a picture from Fort Worth, and there's two different pipelines there. The larger one would have a bigger impact, even taken in the whole church that's there on the right, and the smaller one wouldn't reach that. Lots of things that change the way this would actually act on the ground. Like that neighborhood on the left there has, I think, a sound wall along the street. That sound wall would probably act as a barrier and protect those homes behind it to some degree. And this is just basically out of the study that created the whole potential impact radius. That shows how the calculations between operating pressure and size of the pipeline change the impact radius. Just quickly, there's lots of things the local government can do to enhance pipeline safety. Talk about some of those just for a little bit because I think that often gets missed. Oftentimes, the local government is told they can't do anything, that they're preempted by federal statute, and that's true. Local governments can't require a pipeline to put in thicker pipe or more valves or that type of stuff. Everyone that's tried that, I don't know anybody that's got away with that because they're preempted under federal law or state law often. But they can do a lot of stuff using their land use planning near pipelines, which was a huge issue that Jeff mentioned this morning. The Pipeline and Informed Planning Alliance was a group that put 130 smart people in a room to try to figure out what could be done by local governments. And the main issue is kind of exemplified by this picture. This is a pipeline near where I live. It's a Williams gas pipeline. Most of these big transmission pipelines, they didn't want to run through the middle of a community. That wasn't easy for them. They put them in rural areas. So this was a picture in 1990. Here's the exact same aerial picture 10 years later. And this is happening all over the country. This isn't even particularly the most scary of the one. scary because you see shopping malls, you see schools, all kinds of stuff getting built on top of pipelines where pipelines were there first. And that's really what the whole PIPA group tried to work with. How does local government help prevent those types of things? This is one of my favorite ones because this just has so many layers of bad planning exemplified. That dotted line there is a jet fuel pipeline. I can't remember the diameter. I think it's 16 inches. It was there before anything else was there, so it was in a green field. Then the houses came in next. This is in California. You can see the houses were built pretty close together, pretty much making it hard for an operator or emergency response to get to the pipeline. Wasn't a big deal because they could come from the other side. Well, then they expanded the road back there, and the California Department of Transportation thought they'd be nice to the community by building a sound wall, which is the white line you see there just past the pipeline, effectively sealing this pipeline into these people's backyard. In the meantime, the pipeline company hadn't been paying any attention to the pipeline. People were planting trees, putting sheds, even swimming pool right on top of the pipeline, pretty much creating the worst case scenario for something if something happened back there. This was kind of going, this actually is a military pipeline, so it wasn't under federal jurisdiction, at least not PHMSA's jurisdiction. So it might have been a little worse for that reasons, but certainly California's had a rash of, trying to it's not only California, all over the nation, trying to reclaim their pipeline right-of-ways because they kind of got forgotten for a number of years. A number of best practices kind of recommended in the PIPA report, things like disclosure. Most communities have no requirement that if you're buying a house that has a transmission pipeline in the backyard that you have to tell anybody that. Here's some pictures from Bellingham, Washington. On the left there is a housing development that went in the year after the pipeline failed that created our organization. The people living in those houses didn't know about this. We went and knocked on their doors and asked, and the realtor had told them, well, that's just a gas distribution line that brings gas to your homes. Well, no, it's a hazardous liquid pipeline that moves jet fuel and gasoline. The pipeline company wasn't paying much attention either. They've since reclaimed this. Whoops. The picture on the right there is a school that went in. The pipeline was there first, and the school district wondered why they got such a screaming deal on this property. Well, it's because they had a pipeline right through the middle of it that they had to put the school in then. After the Bellingham tragedy, people got up in arms and pretty much forced the pipeline company to at least replace the 50-year-old pipeline with a new pipeline there next to the school, especially when it failed after a hydro test right near there. Lots of issues for local government about emergency planning. The industry spends millions of dollars each year trying to get fire departments, police departments to pay attention and think about these types of things, but often there isn't much emphasis for the local governments to listen to that message. So there's a continual push to make sure that local governments are making sure their emergency people are paying attention and are well trained in case in the low probability that something goes wrong. And you've heard a lot about 911. When you talk about what the public can really do, the number one thing, because of all the miles of distribution pipelines that's in anybody's yard that has gas, is to know enough about this. So if you're going to plant a mailbox in your front yard or plant a tree or something, you call 911, or certainly if you're hiring a contractor. Or, as I was doing the other day, I was driving down and there was a contractor excavating just down the road from me, and as I drove by, there was no marks anywhere on the sidewalk. So I called the planning department and said, these people got a permit for what they're doing? We've passed an ordinance in our county that requires any excavation. If you're coming in for an excavation permit, they won't hand you that permit until you show that you've called the one call. Because we have a computerized system in Washington State that they can look it up while you're at the permit counter and figure that out. Somebody had a question. 811, yeah, don't call 911. That'll give you the wrong people and they'll be confused. 811, it went in, how many years ago did 811 start? 6, 7 years ago? 2007, yeah, about 7, 8 years ago, and it's a nationwide number and it works all over the country. It doesn't work in Canada yet. I think they're still working on it in Canada. They don't have that up there. Other thing the public can do is certainly help us push more transparency, help understand transparency. We're more than happy to help work through this. This is one of our older transparency charts with the states. you know, it's a real maze of stuff, and a lot of what we do is try to help interpret and point people in the right direction so we can get allies helping push for pipeline safety. And I think I got through it, and I don't know if I did it in an hour or not, but it was because of all the hecklers in the room, I think. Any questions or any critiques of what I left out that I should be trying to talk about when I go talk about this to communities?
Just another source of information, the American Gas Foundation recently put out, there's flyers out there, recently put out a report on, it's pretty much the history of pipeline safety, what happened before PHMSA came into existence, what they focused on originally, what they've been focused on, the regulations that haven't been passed yet, and then a bit of a look ahead. But this is a really high-level summary. The full report, there's a link on there. Just FYI, there's flyers if anyone wants them.
And I think you'll be seeing, you know, there's lots of data. You know, when we started in '99, you couldn't find anything else about pipelines anywhere. And now there's so much data that, you know, you need a guide to try to figure it out. So I think the next wave of that is certainly PHMSA is talking about creating better, and they're unleashing one today, which will let you compare individual companies versus national averages and stuff, which is pretty amazing. But there still needs to be a better way to put that all up on websites and let people play with it however they want, to visualize it in the way they want. And I think that's the next wave. We hear PHMSA talking about it. Up in Canada, they seem to be talking about it even more. The National Energy Board has hired a person that's talking about visualization, and she gave us a website tour of what she's envisioning, and it would do, even like your report does, she had a timeline slider where you could put incidents up and you could use the timeline slider based on when different regulations kicked in. So integrity management started in 2005. You could do the slider and watch to see if that changed incidents, or, you know, the 811 system came in a certain date, and you could put that versus the timeline slider and watch things, and it was pretty amazing. So I don't know when they'll actually accomplish that, but what they're saying is really good if they can pull it off. Anything else?
Yeah, Jeff had a slide this morning that showed fines paid, I think corrective fines, it was something like $2 billion. Did that comment right?
I think so.
Where does that money go? Goes back into the general treasury. Not to the department, that's not go back to.
Yeah, they don't get to fund themselves by fining people. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons it's set up that way. Congress doesn't want to encourage people. As with my county hat on, I know we don't let the sheriff keep all the fines he does because we don't want him setting up speed traps all over the place. So that's part of it. But so yeah, most all of that type of stuff goes back into the general treasury.
What is PHMSA's budget?
Oh boy, I don't know. Ken, you must have that on the tip of your tongue. Yeah. I don't know. We'll have to ask Jeff. He would know. Yeah, she.
Or Jeff had it.
Yeah, one of them had it in their slide. I think Jeff had a slide of it, but yeah, I don't know what their budget is. The which?
The mapping system does not include distribution.
Right, that national pipeline mapping system I showed only includes the big transmission natural gas lines and hazardous liquid. It does not include the local distribution systems. They're, you know, it'd be hard to map that because it's a spider web in communities. You can assume if you have gas in a neighborhood, there's those distribution systems up and down every street, leading to the houses too.
One thing for folks who may not know this for sure, on the 811, if you're going to do something, you know, plant stuff, dig stuff up on your property, call 811. They will come out and mark, and there is no charge to the caller. That's
Free service.
That's not something that the caller has to pay for. It gets done.
And usually you have to give them a couple days. I did it. I was putting a new mailbox in. I came home, you know, day after I called them, and I had more lines all over right where I wanted to plant the mailbox. And then I had to look at the lines and said, well, now what the heck do I do? And they don't explain that to you, but at least I knew there was stuff there.
Well, one thing you didn't mention that the Pipeline Safety Trust has done is a number of very good, I think, white papers that go into lots of different pipeline regulatory topics and safety topics. So I'm sure you can find them on the Pipeline Safety Trust website.
Yeah, and I had the presentation I did in Toledo, one of the last slides was more information. It talked about stuff we have and places where you can find it from the industry and from FIMS and stuff too, and that one fell out of this one somehow or another. But thanks for the plug, Bill.
I was gonna say, I just looked it up, the FIMS and ethanol budget for 2015 was $145 million.
All right, thank you.
Was that all the fence?
That was all of them, so.
That's not just the pipeline safety, that would be hazardous material.
I mean,
Right.
it breaks it down, there's about 26 million of that for hazardous material. That was right down.
So Jeff did have a slide that I think broke it out, and we'll have all that stuff posted on our website probably by the time you get home. Anything else? Standing between you and lunch? Glenn's going to hold you up.
Carl, does 811 have any data that tells us how effective it has been?
Well, that's an issue, and I'm trying to decide if I'm going to poke at that one this afternoon or not. But it does to some degree. It's kind of spotty, and it varies a lot from state to state. That's kind of one of the things that FIMS is grading states on, is how well they're looking at their data to see whether it's acting in the right places. There's a thing that the Common Ground Alliance does called the DIRT report, where pipeline operators, excavators, all can report incidents. And it's kind of, if you looked at those pie charts where I talked about, I don't know what the number is, 42 incidents from excavation damage, that really doesn't tell the story well at all, because if you look in that DIRT report, you find out there's 100,000 incidents where someone has dinged a pipeline, but it didn't cause enough damage for it to end up in the PHMSA database. So there is some of that stuff, and some states are getting pretty good at requiring excavators and pipeline companies to report that stuff, and other companies aren't, so it really varies a lot from state to state. But it's one of those things that's getting better. In Texas, you can actually look up, they have it down so well, you can see who the worst, when we were doing a project in Fort Worth, we pulled up, okay, who's the excavators that are hitting stuff in Fort Worth a lot, because we were doing stuff for the city of Fort Worth, and oops, it ended up being Fort Worth Public Works. It's like, oh, I don't think they're going to want me to show this slide.